Welcome to week 3. This week we are covering chapter 3, which is all about sensory evaluation. Now we're going to be covering this chapter over the course of 2 weeks. So the chapters that are 2 weeks are the ones that I consider more important, or I feel like I have a lot more information to share with you, and so I wanted to divide it across 2 weeks. This chapter, we're actually going to cover the second half of the chapter first, as far as my lecture, and then next week I'll cover the first part of the chapter. So we'll actually be starting this lecture where you start reading at page 73, which is a little over halfway through the chapter. The reason I'm starting in the second half of the chapter this week, I normally wouldn't necessarily do that, especially because in this chapter you get the background behind what sensory attributes are first, and then it goes into sensory testing. But we are going to be doing our lab next week, doing some sensory testing during our lab, and so I wanted you to have seen some of this and hear some of my lecture on the testing and some of the reasoning behind some of the things that we're going to be doing before the lab. But also I wanted to make sure that you've got the full run of all of the actual sensory evaluation information before we go on our field trip, which will be next Friday, to Dr. Rhonda Miller's lab, where we'll also be doing some sensory things. So I wanted you to have the full week of going through that before we do that. So, and that way you'll get more out of that field trip. So starting on page 73 is where we're going to start here, and we're just going to go straight into sensory evaluation. Now, the first couple slides are actually from the beginning of the chapter, just a very brief background of what sensory evaluation is, and then we'll get into the meat of sensory testing. So what is sensory evaluation? It's the human analysis of things to do with the senses: taste, smell, sound, feel, appearance of food. Okay, now the book will tell you that sensory evaluation is subjective. I'm going to disagree with the book a little bit and tell you that it can be subjective or objective. So the subjective part of sensory evaluation would be asking untrained people to rate an attribute. How much do you like this? That is a very subjective question. But we can also do sensory evaluation in an objective way, and we will cover how that happens. But objectively, you can use a panel that has been trained very well. They're almost like machines to evaluate foods for specific attributes. And so their training is such that when they give you a value, it's not an opinion, it's a fact. And so disagreeing with the book here, that sensory evaluation can be subjective or also objective. So key point there, disagreement with the book. Well, what's the purpose of sensory evaluation? Okay, so an obvious point would be learning whether consumers are going to like the food. So this would apply to a new food, like your product development projects, perhaps. You have an idea and you bring it to the table, but what if that actually isn't very good? You know, my taste buds are very different from the general public's taste buds. And so you want to have general public opinion about your product before you have this big launch, and you've put all this money into not only developing the formulation for the product, but purchasing equipment, doing the marketing, all of the special packaging that a product might have, and then getting it into stores, and then realize it's going to be a flop because no one actually likes it. So that is a really important part of the product development process, is having that sensory evaluation done. Now, we are not going to have time for that in our projects, so we're not going to necessarily do a consumer panel for sensory evaluation. or for any sensory evaluation for your product development projects. But just know that it is a necessary part of true product development. Okay. But other things happen too. Like, what if I have an ingredient in my project and the price of that ingredient has gone through the roof and I need to make a change? In order to even make my product feasible anymore, selling it at a price point my consumers will purchase. So I swap out an ingredient for a cheaper option that I think has the same functionality. Are the consumers going to be able to notice a difference? And if they do, are they still going to like it if I've made an ingredient change? That's a very common scenario, is um, making changes in formulation due to cost. Another potential scenario is I'm trying to duplicate a product. I am a processor, and HEB has said, I want a product that is a generic HEB brand, but I want it to be just like this brand name product. We don't have one yet. Can you develop it? And so my goal as a food scientist is to duplicate that product. So I don't know what the original recipe is, or maybe sometimes I do, because a secret about a lot of generic brands is that they're made by the same people as makes the name brand product. Now, is the formulation different? Yes, it's going to be a cheaper formulation, but more often than not, there is a name brand company that is actually making the generic products. HEB isn't making them themselves. And I can tell you that firsthand because working for Smithfield, we made a lot of generic products. We made a lot of products that said Smithfield on them, and then we made a lot of products that said HEB, Hill Country Fair, Parkview, which is an Aldi brand. We definitely had Kirkland Signature, Costco. We had Members Mark, Sam's Club. So the same company was making a lot of the same products, and in a lot of cases, zero difference in quality. So that's some cool, like, good consumer knowledge to have, is that name brand often doesn't actually mean much, and generic brands are just as good in a lot of cases. But if I am duplicating a product, I want it to basically taste the same as what we're trying to copycat. Another example would be just trying to figure out what the full flavor profile of a food is. Like, what are the key notes that this food should have? This gets really involved in things like wine tasting, cheese. Cheese has a flavor profile that has some of the funniest sounding flavors. If you get a chance, there is one of the videos in this week's playlist, and I don't remember what it's called, but just look for it. And it's talking about what is sensory science. And there is a very famous sensory scientist. She has written literally a textbook that I've used my entire career about sensory science. And she's talking about cheese and the flavor notes in cheese, and some of it might disgust you, but these are actual flavors that can be picked out by trained sensory scientists in cheese. So it's really cool. Then does the product taste the same on day 1 as it does on day 101? Because these products that are being produced by the food industry, they aren't sold the same day, right? It's not from your kitchen, from the kitchen to the table. They are going to be packaged and stored for some length of time until they finally reach your home and your table. And so that product freshness needs to maintain. And if it only maintains for a certain length of time, then the food processor needs to know what that time limit is. And that's how shelf life days are set. Now, there's also set for safety. So that is always first and foremost. We're not going to go over the shelf life days that are the maximum for safety. But quality also, how long will that quality maintain from a sensory perspective until consumers would start to notice the difference, and we shouldn't have our shelf life beyond that amount. Okay, so that is a very common sensory testing need. And the key thing here is we actually only have people that can do this at this point, at least certainly affordably. There aren't robotics or AI that can do all this for us yet. Now, we can learn some things through different testing mechanisms. So, for example, you're going to get a lot of meat examples from me. In the meat industry, I worked for a processed meats company, and we could look at the microbiology of what was going on. And so you could see by testing total plate counts, the total amount of bacteria on a product, how over time that increased. But that didn't necessarily correlate with flavor. And that does not necessarily correlate with safety either. In fact, it usually doesn't. And we'll get into that when we go through our safety chapter. So you still needed that people element of someone smelling the product, just opening it up, getting that first whiff, looking at the product. Like if you've ever had your lunch meat in the refrigerator too long, or hot dogs, you might notice that there's a slime, right? And that's an indication that it's gone bad, right? And so people looking at that over time, and also, of course, tasting the product. And we had these people doing it, testing all the time, just to make sure that we were maintaining what we needed for product quality for the shelf life that it was supposed to get. And so we just don't have a way to do this with machinery at this point. And so people are needed, not just when we are first formulating a product, but also all the way through when we are just regularly producing it, making sure that we are producing a quality product. So there are three main types of sensory evaluation. The first type is going to be called let me backtrack. So in the book, there's the definition of a taste test panel. This is a general description that describes all the sensory panels that we can do that involve taste. Okay, so a taste test panel is every single panel that we're going to talk about after this. Okay, so it's just a group of people that evaluate the flavor, texture, appearance, and aroma of the food products. Okay, and it can be a group of trained people or untrained people. Now we'll get into the three main types of sensory testing. The first type is a trained panel, and this is also known as descriptive testing. So descriptive, we're going to describe. These people are trained to describe all of the flavors that are in a product and what level they're at. So they are highly trained. These are the people that if there was a machine, they're just as good as the machines at saying what flavors exist within a product. Okay. Before they ever taste the actual product, they'll be training on the individual tastes, flavors, odors, textures, appearance that could be in that product. So for example, your basic taste, sweet, salt, bitter, sour. Okay. When I worked in the sensory lab, we would train our panelists with solutions of chemicals, that is not a bad thing, chemicals, that brought these tastes. Okay, so for example, saltiness. Okay, the basic taste of saltiness. We would have a solution with 0 salt, and that was a 0 for salt, for saltiness. Okay, we'd have a solution that had a little bit more, or had some percentage of salt, just a little bit, and that would be a 5 for saltiness. We had a solution that was so salty you're just like bleh, and immediately needed to rinse your mouth out. That would be a 15 for saltiness. Okay, and so they would train on these reference samples and be able to recognize this is a 5, this is a 7, this is a 10, this is a 15, and then when they try the food, they can immediately recognize what level of that taste was in the food. Okay, we did the same thing for sweet. Sweetness was sugar. For sour, we use citric acid, a solution with citric acid. For bitter, we actually use a solution that had caffeine in it, pure caffeine. And they would not drink it. They would spit it out. And that's something that we will learn about with our sensory testing is spit cups. But that's the idea. For other flavors that are found in foods, so foods of animal origin have some funky flavors that can be behind them. Okay, so when you're talking about a steak, there can be a grassy flavor. There can be a barnyard flavor, and think about the smell when you're in a barn. That's what that flavor is describing. There can be flavor called musty. So panelists would actually have reference samples for these. Now, not all of them were things that they tasted, okay? So like for a barnyard flavor, they might just have something that they smell, because flavor is both taste and smell put together. So you have taste and aroma, and all of that goes up the back of your throat, hits your nose, and combines with the taste buds and its flavor. Okay, and we'll learn more about that when I go through that part of the lecture next week. But my key point here is that lots of reference samples, so they can be basically like machines and tell you this is the level of every flavor that they can pick up. Okay, so with just a few bites, these trained panelists can rate over a dozen attributes, maybe even more, maybe a couple dozen, and maybe even one bite. Okay, very highly trained, very good. Now, what is this even used for? Why do we need to have people trained this well? Okay, well, it's used in product development. So if we are trying to duplicate a product and we have nothing but the ingredient statement, which often has a generic spices in it, right? And you have no idea what the spices are, these people can pick these spices out. Okay, they're trained to be able to say, oh, there is sage, nutmeg, and clove in here, right? And so it can help in product development. It can help with product grading. So I'm gonna show you here cheese grading. We're gonna go to, let me show this. Okay, so we're going to US standards for grades of cheddar cheese. There are people who actually are trained to pick out all these flavors in cheddar cheese and accurately grade it. Okay, so cheese is given grades of AA, A, B, or C based on quality. AA is the highest quality, C is the lowest quality. Okay, so and this particular example is cheddar cheese. Okay, and so I'm going to scroll down because there's a nice little table here. Okay, so for a grade AA cheese, okay, we're going to just look at the cured one. Let me increase this. Okay, So we have fine and highly pleasing characteristic cheddar cheese flavor showing moderate to well-developed degrees of flavor or sharpness. May possess a very slight feed flavor, so that's an interesting flavor note, right? But shall be free from any undesirable flavors and odors. And then when we get to texture, because they're also trained on texture and appearance. So a plug drawn from the cheese shall be firm, appear smooth, waxy, compact, close, and translucent, but may have a few mechanical openings if not large and connecting. So it might have some like tiny holes, but not big. Shouldn't have curds and should possess a velvet-like texture, right? So that is a mouthfeel texture, right? You imagine the feel of velvet in your mouth. Going to color, right? Uniform, bright, attractive appearance, practically free from white lines or seams, may show tiny white specks, colored or uncolored, but if colored should be medium yellow orange. Okay, so then if we go to grade A, so one less in quality, okay? 1 grade less in quality. So now we get, it still has moderate to well-developed degrees of flavor, sharpness, pleasing characteristic flavor, may possess the following flavors to a slight degree. So we have to differentiate between slight and moderate and heavy, right? So bitter, feed, and acid, okay? The texture of this, still free from curdiness, can have a little bit more holes, but still free from other gas holes. May have some crumbly, mealy, short, weak, and pasty texture. Any idea what short texture is, right? But these people know it. Okay. Going down to grade B. Okay, so now we can have these flavors to a slight degree. Slight onion, right? We could have slight flat, yeasty, malty, old milk, weedy, barny, lipase, and sulfide. And we could have now to a definite degree that feed flavor, acid, bitter, fruity, utensil. So imagine that is the flavor of like when you just have a fork in your mouth and that's it. And whey taint, okay? And when we get into texture, you could have more open holes, short, mealy, weak, pasty, and crumbly texture, right? And then the worst grade of cheese, okay, can possess slight onion and the following flavors to a definite degree. So now we can have like major of these flavors going on: flat, sour, metallic, yeasty, malty, old milk, weedy, barny, lipase, and sulfide. And to a pronounced degree, so even higher, feed, acid, bitter, fruity, utensil, and whey taint. Okay. So what even are some of these, right? And you'd have to be a sensory scientist trained to taste cheese to know it. And of course, for the texture, you can now have open, sweet holes, short, weak, pasty, crumbly, and mealy texture, okay, to a pronounced degree. Okay. So this is just an example to show you what people actually are trained to do. Like there's someone whose job is to grade cheese and assign these grades by the USDA, and they obviously need to know their stuff when it comes to flavor. Finally, product release. So trained panel will be there to kind of also, like, one of the things that you want to do when you're first releasing a product is have a baseline. Like, these are the flavors that this product should have, and have that written down so that 5 years in the future, you can look back and it's like, has this product changed somehow in the last 5 years? So what was our baseline? We have it written down. We don't remember tasting it in the beginning, but we've written it down, and what flavors and what level those flavors should be at. And so 5 years in the future, we can have a group taste the same product and rate those flavors and see if it has changed. And those things do happen, just general process changes and things over time that you don't even realize is going on. Or change in quality of ingredients over time. Okay. So one key thing, if you ever become a trained panelist, you can no longer be a consumer panelist, because you think too analytically. I mean, imagine what your brain has to do when you are evaluating a food and assigning all of these numbers to, like, dozens of flavors. Well, then when you try a food as a consumer, you're also doing that in your head. And so trained panelists are not good consumer panelists because they don't think like a regular consumer anymore. Okay, so the second main type of sensory panel is a consumer panel, and this is also known as affective testing. So affective means relating to moods, feelings, or attitudes. Okay, so this type of testing, the goal is to determine what will the average consumer prefer. What do they like? Do they prefer it enough to buy it? So often during consumer testing, we'll ask them, what is the price at which you would buy this product? What is the price at which you wouldn't buy this product? Will you buy this product? Generally, these consumer panels are going to be given a hedonic scale. So hedonic is a like or dislike scale. So I extremely dislike, I dislike, neutral, like, extremely like kind of scale. A type of consumer panel of affective testing, so this is a subset of that, would be a focus group. So in this type of sensory test, the consumers would try the product and then they talk about it in a group setting. And it's going to be led by a moderator that is probably with or working for the company that is offering the food. And their goal is just to, in a conversational way, learn how consumers feel about the food product. Another consumer sensory test, it would be an in-home use test. So in this type of test, the consumers would take the product home and prepare it just like however they normally would, and then they'd answer a survey on it. Okay, so everything there, the when I said consumer panel and the focus group and the in-home use test, those are all consumer panels of affective testing, seeing what consumers like, dislike about a product. So these are all going to be untrained people, your average consumers, whoever you're marketing it to. Okay. The third type of sensory testing is discriminative testing. Okay, so to discriminate, okay, taking aside the prejudice definition of discriminate, but a second definition of discriminate is to recognize a distinction or to differentiate. Okay, so is there a difference? Recognize, is there a difference in something? Okay, so most people can discriminate between normal and dairy-free ice cream because dairy-free ice cream is usually less creamy. So there's an example of discriminate. So in discriminative testing, we are asking, can consumers or our trained panelists, because we can use one or the other for this type of testing, either one, depending on your goals, can they tell the difference between two products? Okay, and so we might be looking at this over time. For example, my shelf life example is the product the same as day 1 versus day 100. We might be interested if we are making a formulation change. We want the product to taste the same, or perhaps we want it to taste better with our new formulation, and we could use discriminative testing to do that. Now, if we're wanting it to taste better, is discriminative the best? Not necessarily. We might want to shoot more for the consumer testing there, but it's an option. If we are trying to make a duplicate of another product, or if there's process changes. So I've talked about ingredient changes, but sometimes changes in your process, and like we think that we have been we think we could decrease mixing time by 5 minutes and still have adequate mixing, and it would decrease the time that this product is on the production line, therefore increasing our product or our profit, because we can make more of it and send more through during the same amount of time during the day. But will that change the texture? You have to think about those things. We want to we think we can change the temperature at which we are cooking this product to, and it will still be food safe, but will it change how the product tastes and the texture, as would be another example. And so anytime you're making some kind of major formulation change or process change, you're going to want to do a test like this to make sure that you are not adversely affecting your product. Okay, so I'm going to now give you some examples of different types of tests that fall under discriminative testing. And I don't necessarily want you to memorize all these, but just to give you an idea of how these samples might be presented. Okay, so one of the most popular one, and the one that we will do in our lab next week, is the triangle test. And so in the triangle test, I'm going to put 3 samples in front of you, and I'll ask you to taste them from left to right. And you're not going to have these nice labels here of A, B, and A, okay? And they probably will look more similar to each other than this. But your job as a panelist is to tell me which one is actually different, okay? So I'll tell you 2 are the same, 1 is different. Pick out which one is different, and you see if you can. Another test is called the A not A test. So you are given an A and a not A sample. So I'm going to give you 2 samples. They're going to be labeled A and not A. And then I'll bring out a 3rd sample, and you taste it and tell me, is it A or is it not A? The same different test. This one, you are given 2 samples and you're asked, are they the same or different? The duo trio test, you're given a control sample. So I'm going to tell you this is the control. This is your reference sample. And then I'll give you 2 other samples, and I'll tell you one of these is the same, one is different, and you tell me which is which. Okay, and that is called the duo trio test. Then the last one I'll talk about, there's actually a lot more than this, just different ways people have thought of to do these tests, is the difference from control. So this one I have used, and I'll show you an example. That I've used it in my career. I've used triangle tests too, but difference from control, you're given the control and you are given unknown samples, and you're asked, how different are these samples? So I've given you a control, I give you another sample. How different is this sample from the control that I just gave you? And so in this test, the advantage of that is that it not only tells you whether a difference exists, but it tells you a good estimate of what the size of that difference is. Is it extreme or is it really, really minor? So this is actually from a study that I did when I worked in the food industry. And there's nothing really proprietary here about this, so I just copied it and showed it to you here. And so in this study, we were looking at bacon, and so we gave samples in 4 sets. Each set, the sample mark C, was the control sample. And so they would evaluate that first. Now the control sample for each set was likely different. So one of them, like in one set, it may have been the actual control. In another set, it may have actually been the treatment that we were testing to see if it had an effect. But they don't know that. All they know is here is a control sample, okay? And you're only comparing within that test to that sample, okay? And so they're asked to rank how different the test sample is in overall flavor, using a scale from no difference, which is 0, to a very large difference, which is 9, okay? And we asked them to only look at overall flavor, not acceptability. So don't judge the difference whether you liked it or not, basically. Okay. We did warn them that sometimes the test sample might be a duplicate control. So it was possible to get a 0 because there was no difference if it was the same type of sample. We wouldn't tell them if they had that sample, but we basically eliminated the error of them thinking it had to be different. So then at the end, after they would rate the difference, there would be a comment section, and those are extremely valuable when you're doing sensory testing because it gives you an idea of like what flavors are different and what people are thinking. And then we'll talk about this, but then they also had bagels and carbonated water that they would take in between, but to help get the fat flavor out of their mouths because it was a bacon study. And there was also a spit cup. Okay, so what are some things that we need to keep in mind when we are doing sensory testing? There are things in the environment as well as psychological things that can really influence how sensory panelists react to what they're tasting. So a big key one is other testers. So in a professional sensory testing location, whether they are having consumers come in or using a trained panel, they will often have booths that have dividers so that the panelists cannot see each other. And not only that, but they will not be allowed to talk to each other. So you don't want them exchanging looks, talking about things, because you don't want them influencing each other. Okay. And I mean, this was an issue when I worked in the industry. We would have like meetings to discuss shelf life of products. And so all of us would be around a table, all tasting the same product at the same time. And you could often tell when there were executives in the room that a lot of people would just stay quiet and wait until they heard what those executives said. And then there would be agreement. And so a lot of times as the scientists in the room, we'd have to be like, okay, everybody write down your answer before you talk. So they weren't just basing their thoughts on something somebody else said. Because people taste things differently. Not only degree, but what things taste like in general. There's some people who can't taste rancidity at all, even some of the grossest product imaginable, that as the fat has really gone bad, and others who the slightest bit of rancidity, they're practically gagging, more sensitive to it. And other flavors, they might not be that sensitive. And so particularly, so with the trained panel, you've trained that out of them, but with consumers, you don't want them influencing each other. Okay, another thing that we can use to get rid of some influence is color. So if the products that we're testing have color differences, and that's not what we are judging. For example, we only want the consumers to judge the product based on flavor and texture, for example. But we know there's a color difference. Then we will disguise that with tricky things like light. So just a red light, and your eyes are just not seeing things the way they're normally seen, and it disguises those color differences. We used it a lot when I worked at the university with meat samples. Can't tell whether it's well done or rare, and that helped quite a bit because people have biases too with that. Some people prefer a well done steak, even though medium rare tastes the best, in my opinion. And so you disguise that with the red lights. Okay. Other things that can influence panelists, aromas. So you don't want to have your sensory panel in the kitchen where you've cooked the product. Not only because they can smell really well what you've just cooked, but also it can overwhelm the senses. So if you have been standing in a room where they've been cooking cookies for the last hour, and then you have cookies placed in front of you, you're not going to be able to tell the difference because everything smells like cookies. The air smells like cookies. And even if one cookie smells very strongly of some great flavor, some great aroma, and the other does not, you're not going to be able to pick that out. Okay. So usually these sensory panel rooms are kept separate from a kitchen. And you see that there's like a little door here, and that door will be open, the sample put through, and door closed, so that you're not getting aromas from the room where they were preparing the product. Okay. You also have aromas that linger just from consuming the product. Okay. So these are like flavor type aromas, okay, that just stay in your mouth. It's like, the oil coating in your mouth that has a flavor to it. Trying to think of other examples. I mean, like coffee. The coffee flavor might linger in your mouth, for example. And so, yeah, any flavor that kind of lingers in your mouth. And so you want to do offer things that will clear those flavors. So depending on the flavor, it may be very simple or complex. So water might be plenty, just some distilled water that has no extra flavors from tap water. Saltines that have unsalted tops, so there's less salt that your panelists are consuming, are great to have also in between sampling products. Ricotta cheese we used a lot to clear flavors. In that ballot that I showed you from when I did an industry before, we used bagels to help clear flavors. And sparkling water is also really good at removing lingering aromas from the mouth. So a few weeks ago, my husband and I went out to dinner, and I had a fruity drink, and I was drinking this fruity drink all through the meal, and then we had dessert, and dessert was like this rich chocolate dessert. And I told my waiter, it's like, this is not going well with my drink. This, like, the dessert tasted great, but then I went back to my drink, and my drink tasted awful. And he was like, let me fix that for you. And he brought me some sparkling water, and I took a drink right after I'd had a bite of my dessert, and then went back to my fruity drink, and it tasted normal again. And so it is because those lingering aromas, flavors in my mouth were messing up the interaction of the flavor of the next thing. So it's like kind of good stuff to know, just on a personal level as a consumer, that you can affect the flavor of the next thing by what you just previously ate and how you can fix that. Okay, aromas and temperature. So temperature has a big impact on how flavors are, big word here, volatilized in your mouth. So these flavors, they're volatilized, they go up your nasal passages, you smell it, and it's part of the flavor of the product. Okay, well, temperature has a big impact on that. So whether I am eating a cold piece of steak or a fresh off the grill piece of steak, they're going to taste different because of the temperature. And that goes with any food. And so you want to make sure that you serve all your products that are in a test at the same temperature. So if my product is a cooked product that needs to be served warm, or is generally served warm, then I want to make sure that all my panelists are getting that at the same temperature, and all the samples that they get are at the same temperature, which can be a complex thing when you are serving a lot of people in these panels. Okay. Another bias people can have is with numbers. So if I label my samples 1, 2, 3, people tend to prefer low numbers. So if I'm saying which one's different, they're going to guess 1 more often, just as a general rule. So if I have 100 people, I'm going to get more 1s. If for example they're actually all the same, more of them are just going to guess 1. Also, if letters are at the beginning of the alphabet, so they'll guess A, A instead of if I have ABC. Okay, so we take away this tendency of the goal. Like, people just want to be right, and so they guess the way that they think is going to be right. And so we can take away this tendency to really try to guess right by using 3-digit codes. So if it's a 2-digit number, we just add a 0 to make it 3-digit. And these codes, it just kind of equalizes it. And it's been scientifically proven that it works. And so we give 3-digit codes to everything. Okay, and then a last influence that I'll talk about is fatigue. Your sensitivity to flavors, aromas and even basic tastes will decrease with how much you've been stimulated. Okay, so, and this is very sample dependent. So if I have something that is bland, I'm going to be able to give my panelists more of that before their taste buds become and olfactory senses, your nose smelling, becomes fatigued. But if I have something that is very highly flavored, they're going to become fatigued much more quickly. And so that's something that you have to keep in mind when you're doing sensory tests is how intense is this flavor? How soon are they going to fatigue? What's the maximum number of samples I can give before that happens to make sure I don't go over it? This example here, this is a wine example, and it's just smelling wine, okay? And it's showing that as they smell their 4th glass of wine, so it's like, like a professional wine connoisseur, right? As they smell their 4th glass of wine, that perceived intensity of aroma has dropped down substantially compared to the 1st glass of wine that they smelled. Okay. And so there's 2 ways we help get over this. One, you just limit the number of samples that you're giving your panelists so that you don't get past that fatigue point. We'll also give the samples in a different order to different panelists. So for panelist A, I might give this 4th wine sample to him or her first, right? For panelist B, I'm going to give them the 2nd one first. For panelist C, the 1st one first. So that it kind of eliminates that bias from the statistics. Speaking of statistics, I am sorry to do this to you. I'm going to go back real quick and just note something on these discriminative testing. Okay, so what was the point? Why do we have so many different types of discriminative testing? Because I went through this whole list, right? And it's like, and you're like, how are these different? They all seem the same to me. And they are. And the reason that there are so many different kinds, they have different statistical power. And so I'm not going to go through each one and exactly how that is. But let's say, for example, okay, same different test. You only have 2 samples. Are they the same or different? So your chances of guessing that right are 50-50, right? Versus the triangle test, I have 3 samples and one is different. Your chances of guessing that right is only 33%. And so this triangle test has much more statistical power than the same different test. Okay, I can have fewer panelists on this and be able to learn more about which one is actually different than I can with the same difference test. And when I'm looking at the numbers, I have to consider what is the chance of guessing it right? So if I am only at 33% of people could guess it right on the triangle test, then it's not different, right? Even though 33% of people said the right answer, it's not different because that's the guessing rate, right? 40% still might not be different depending on how many people I have testing it. Now, if I have 200 people and 40% say that they can guess, give the right answer for which one is different, there's probably some statistical proof there that there's a little bit of difference. Not everybody can tell the difference, but and that's the thing too, is like what level of difference are you willing to accept that it's okay? Well, like it's okay if 10% of the population can tell the difference because the 90% is what's going to give me the money, right? 90% is still most of my consumers still can't tell the difference, right? So that's why we have different types of discriminative testing is for statistical power. And different situations work for different things. If I have a sample, so going back to fatigue, so if I have a sample that is going to fatigue people easily, well, this same different test, I don't have to give them as many samples. It's just 2, right? Versus the 3, I'm going to start getting more fatigue in the triangle test versus the same different test. Okay. Okay, so last couple slides here is talking about evaluation forms. I'm showing you what they look like. So there are different scale styles. So here, this would all be consumer evaluation, okay? So hedonic scales measures like or dislike overall acceptance. We have here a 9-point, we call it end anchored. So we're telling them at each end, this is extremely tender, this is extremely tough, and then we tell what's neutral, and we just have them pick a number or pick a box in between that describes their like or dislike of the sample. We have just right scales. Is this good or is it too high or too low? So this is like saltiness is a great example. Like, is it too salty? Is it not salty enough? Or is it just right? Okay. This just depends on what you're trying to learn. Okay. Intensity scales. So how intense is this flavor for you? Is it extremely intense or is it not intense at all? Then we have also scale types. So scale styles is like, what are we asking for? Scale types is just a different way of presenting the scale. So we could have a category scale, which is what we had up here. So extremely tender to extremely tough. These category scales are just checking a box. Okay. A linear scale I would have my consumer on this scale mark where you're at. with this product. And so they would actually make a physical mark here, saying, okay, this is, towards the tough side, but more than neutral, but not extremely tough, and then mark that there. And we would actually measure that with a ruler when we get all of the ballots back in. Okay. And then a magnitude estimation scale. So we're saying first sample that you evaluated had a tenderness rating of 50. In proportion to 50, what do you think this tenderness rating is? Is it double? Is it 100? Is it triple? Is it 150? Is it half? Is it 25? And so they would actually put in a number there. Okay. So like I showed you on the last one, so scale of dislike to like. The key thing with these scales is you'll always have an odd number. So you have, one end, the other end, and in the middle you have neutral. Okay. You have at least 5 boxes. Okay, so you at least go from 1 to 5 on the boxes. And for consumers, you don't go more than 9, because it just gets too tricky for them. Their consumers are generally not able to differentiate differentiate to that small level if you have more than 9 categories. Now, a trained panelist, yes, you can definitely have more than 9 for them. Trained panelist, you can have 15 to 20. So for kids, we might use this kind of scale, right? This makes more sense, and especially if you have non-readers. And so how do you feel about this product? From love it, happy face, to hate it, sad face. The line scale, I already talked about. This is another example of the line scale. Here you have just some anchors here in the middle rather than at the ends. So negative to positive on the scale. Okay. So another couple examples, I already showed you this one. This is the one from my sensory study. Here is another consumer one. So here we would first ask, okay, so this is a 9-point scale. Indicate your overall like or dislike of the sample. And then secondary, okay, so how do you feel specifically about the flavor of the sample? So we're still asking them about the same product, but we're asking slightly different questions because we can learn more than just how do you like or dislike this sample overall, right? So how do you like the flavor? How do you feel about the intensity of the flavor, all right? So like knowing this is like, this tells us more about like what they don't like or like about or what they do like about the flavor. How do you feel about the intensity of the salty flavor of the sample? Then we might have open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are extremely valuable because you often don't know what you should be asking, and this is where they'll tell you. So what did you like about the flavor? What did you dislike about the flavor? And then here, we continue on. So here we asked all about flavor, right? It said overall, we ask all about flavor. Then we ask about texture. So what is your overall like or dislike of the texture of the sample? And related to that, how do you feel about the level of tenderness of the sample? So this would be like a meat one, right? We're talking about tough and tender, okay? So those are some examples of ballots that you would use for sensory, and kind of what situations, why we would do that. That is all we have for this week, and we will see you on Tuesday and do some triangle testing of our own. See if you can discriminate a difference between some products. I'll have a great week.